In her office on Newbury Street, where the soft autumn sunlight filtered through the windows, Elizabeth Gray was reviewing the final transaction documents. Another successful luxury condominium sale would be added to her achievements. Outside, maple leaves swayed in the wind, adding splashes of color to Boston's cityscape. The historic buildings of the Back Bay District wore warm expressions in the evening light. "Ellie, congratulations! Another wonderful closing. You're top of the office this year." Jane's voice made Elizabeth look up from her desk, where her eyes fell on the wedding invitation. The date and time were elegantly engraved on cream-colored paper of the finest quality. Next Saturday, at the Four Seasons Hotel Boston, she would begin a new chapter in her life with Michael Foster, the architect. "Thank you, but my head's full of wedding preparations right now," Elizabeth smiled as she checked a message from the florist on her smartphone. A pure white bouquet of white roses and Casablanca lilies. Floral arrangements to decorate the chapel. Everything was supposed to be perfect for the wedding. Her meeting with Michael came about through a real estate project 3 years ago. Elizabeth, who was tasked with selling the high-rise condominium he had designed, found herself drawn to his sincerity and talent throughout the project. On the night he proposed, Michael accepted her past and promised her a future. For Elizabeth, it felt like the beginning of a new life. However, memories of the weekend spent at her family home in Beacon Hill suddenly weighed heavily on her heart. As usual, conversations with her parents revolved around her sister Rachel. Rachel's children's activities, Rachel's husband's promotion, Rachel's new home renovation plans. Rachel's smiling face was at the center of every family photograph displayed in the room. Rachel just bought a new Steinway grand piano for the children. Isn't she a wonderful mother? David certainly spares no expense for what they want, Martha's proud voice still echoed in her ears. John nodded silently while pulling out his checkbook again. The parents had continued their unfailing support to meet her sister's necessary expenses. A new car, private school tuition for the children, luxurious vacations. All of Rachel's demands were met by their parents. Meanwhile, when Elizabeth asked for help with tuition to get her real estate license, her parents dismissed her, saying she was bold enough to be independent. During holiday family gatherings, Rachel's schedule always took priority, with Elizabeth's convenience coming second. Even in family photos, Rachel sat in the center while Elizabeth was made to stand at the edge. That was the daily reality of the Gray family. Memories from childhood raced through her mind like a fleeting montage. Lavish parties for Rachel's birthdays. Elizabeth's birthdays were always celebrated modestly by tradition. Even at high school graduation, her parents' praise for Rachel's academic achievements overshadowed Elizabeth's efforts. "Mom, Dad, I'm not inviting Rachel to the wedding," Elizabeth finally conveyed her decision the other day. A heavy silence fell over the stately dining room in Beacon Hill. Only the antique wall clocks ticking marked the tension in the air. "But she's family? Sisters shouldn't." Disapproval colored her mother's voice. Her father heaved a deep sigh and said, "I respect your choice." However, his eyes didn't meet his daughter's. They remained fixed on the wine in his glass. After completing the final check at the Four Seasons Hotel's grand ballroom, Elizabeth looked down at the city through the large windows. The Charles River sparkled in the sunset. A new life with Michael. Hope of freedom from past burdens. The room decorations, menu, music, everything had been prepared exactly as planned. In the bridal suite, Elizabeth took a deep breath. Outside the window, the September blue sky stretched wide, and maple leaves swayed in the autumn breeze. Looking at her reflection in the antique mirror, she smiled quietly. Her pure white wedding dress harmonized perfectly with the lace veil inherited from her grandmother. "Ellie, you're the most beautiful bride," said Jane, who was serving as maid of honor, as she adjusted the tiara for the final touch. As a longtime best friend, she was one of the few who understood Elizabeth's scars from 10 years ago. "Something blue?" Jane asked. "Mom's sapphire earrings." "Something borrowed?" "Your pearl bracelet." "And something new is that tiara." They laughed like schoolgirls as they confirmed the traditional something old, new, borrowed, and blue. At that moment, there was a knock at the door, and her father entered. "Ready?" His voice sounded softer than usual. His figure in the tuxedo exuded dignity, yet somehow also showed vulnerability. Elizabeth nodded and took his arm. The chapel's pipe organ had begun to play. The solemn strains of Bach's Ave Maria echoed through the old hallway. Beyond the doors, 300 guests were waiting. And at the altar, Michael, dressed in a deep blue tuxedo, would be waiting for her. The doors opened, and all the guests rose. Elizabeth began walking down the center aisle decorated with white roses and Casablanca lilies, guided by her father. On both sides were business associates, college friends, Michael's family. And in the front row sat her mother Martha. Elizabeth's heart nearly stopped. Next to her mother sat someone who shouldn't have been there. Rachel. Wearing a flashy blue dress with a smug expression. Next to her were her husband David and their 2 children. No way. Before she could collect herself, they reached the altar. Michael welcomed her with a warm smile. The ceremony proceeded solemnly, vows were exchanged, and rings were given. However, anxiety and anger swirled in Elizabeth's heart. The reception began, and the newlyweds' entrance was announced. The grand ballroom was bathed in champagne gold lighting, with elegant white rose centerpieces adorning the tables. To the orchestra's rendition of "Fly Me to the Moon," Elizabeth and Michael proceeded to the dance floor amid thunderous applause. After their first dance, the celebration began. From the New England clam chowder starter to the lobster main course, the dishes were served in perfect sequence. However, Elizabeth could barely eat. Rachel's presence was tying her stomach in knots. And then, the worst moment arrived. Just before dessert was served, Rachel suddenly stood up and took the microphone. Their parents nodded to each other slightly, as if they knew something. As the room fell silent, Rachel's voice began to ring out. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to offer some words of blessing for my sister." Her voice mixed sweetness with poison. Elizabeth stared at her sister, frozen. Michael squeezed her hand. But first, there's something you should know. A dangerous light flickered in Rachel's eyes. Elizabeth could sense what was coming. But it was too late to stop it. My sister abused me. A slight murmur arose from the room. She tried to monopolize our parents' affection and tried to ruin my life. She even tried to steal my fiancé. It was a complete lie. The truth was exactly the opposite. Our parents know my sister's true nature, but they remain silent today. She's even mean to my children. Rachel's voice carried a theatrical tremor. The atmosphere in the room froze. Their parents watched Rachel with satisfied expressions. Michael's hand gripped Elizabeth's even tighter. A wave of disturbance spread among the guests. Elizabeth's work colleagues wore confused expressions, while Michael's family was dumbfounded. And in the eyes of Elizabeth's close friends burned flames of anger. Something broke inside Elizabeth. And simultaneously, a new determination was born. She would no longer run away. It was time to speak the truth she had sealed away for 10 years. In the heavy atmosphere of the grand ballroom, Elizabeth could hear only her own heartbeat. Each of Rachel's words cut into her heart like sharp blades. Under the table, Michael's hand gripped hers even more tightly. My sister has always played the perfect one, Rachel's voice continued. Her expression now showed feigned sadness. But you don't know the real her. Her obsessive fixation when she tried to steal my fiancé. Her twisted desire to monopolize our parents' affection. Elizabeth felt her vision go white. The memory from 10 years ago came back vividly. That rainy night, the luxury hotel lobby where she discovered her fiancé James meeting secretly with her sister. The searing pain when she witnessed their intimacy. Be quiet. Suddenly, Michael's Aunt Mary stood up. Her stern voice rang out. At a wedding, such. But Rachel wouldn't stop. Rather, her eyes gained an abnormal gleam. My sister was even mean to my children. Hiding Christmas presents, sabotaging birthday parties. Complete fabrications. Elizabeth truly loved her niece and nephew. She always chose thoughtful presents for their birthdays and had even taken them to amusement parks on holidays. However, Rachel had always found reasons to distance Elizabeth from the children. Their parents' expressions grew increasingly satisfied. In their eyes floated the joy of seeing their long-term plan bear fruit. And what's most unforgivable? Rachel created a dramatic pause. The atmosphere in the room grew even tenser. Is that my sister is trying to destroy my current marriage too? She tried to feed David false information about my past. At that moment, something changed decisively within Elizabeth. There was no reason to remain silent anymore. Michael looked at her and nodded slightly. His eyes held a strong will, saying, I'm on your side. Elizabeth slowly stood up. The room fell dead silent. She took the microphone from Rachel's hand. That action contained 10 years' worth of determination. Everyone, please let me tell you the truth. Elizabeth's voice rang out surprisingly calmly. 10 years ago, I had another fiancé. an investment banker named James Harrison. Her mother suddenly tried to interrupt. "Elizabeth, stop." But Elizabeth continued firmly. "6 months after our engagement, I discovered he was having an affair with my sister." A commotion arose from the room. The color drained from Rachel's face. "That night, I broke off the engagement. I told my parents the truth, but they chose to protect my sister. Under the pretext of protecting the family's honor, this fact was covered up." Elizabeth turned to face her parents. Their expressions rapidly turned pale. "Our parents forgave Rachel's actions as youthful indiscretion and forced me to remain silent. Since then, they have increasingly favored my sister while continuing to neglect me." Michael stood up and took his place beside Elizabeth. His presence gave her great strength. "This is why I decided not to invite my sister today. However, our parents ignored my wishes and secretly invited her." David's face had turned to stone. His eyes were fixed on Rachel. "Rachel, your story about me trying to steal your fiancé was actually the reverse. And about trying to feed false information to David, I was only trying to tell him the truth." Elizabeth exhaled deeply. 10 years' worth of burden was gradually becoming lighter. "I have kept silent for these 10 years. For the sake of family peace, for my sister's children, and for our parents' dignity. But that's no longer necessary." At that moment, a voice rose from the back of the room. "May I also testify?" An investment banker who had been James's colleague stood up. "I knew about James and Ms. Rachel's relationship at the time. I witnessed their secret meetings several times." Next, Elizabeth's college friend stood up. "I know too. Rachel boasted to us, saying it's easy to steal a rich man." As testimonies were revealed one after another, Rachel's face lost more and more color. Their parents could only remain silent in the face of facts they couldn't excuse. Suddenly, Rachel's phone rang. She hurriedly checked the screen. It was a message from her husband's lawyer. David was demanding immediate separation and initiating divorce proceedings. Rachel nearly fainted on the spot. I. Uttering incoherent words, Rachel fled the room like she was escaping. There wasn't a trace of her former arrogance in her retreating figure. Their parents watched their daughter's flight in a daze. They couldn't stop the instant collapse of the facade of respectability and false family image they had built up over the years. "Elizabeth," her father called out in a trembling voice. But he couldn't continue. Her mother covered her face with a handkerchief, shaking slightly. This time, it wasn't an act, but seemed like genuine tears of regret. At this point, Michael's mother Charlotte quietly stood up. David's mother, with her elegant bearing, tried to smooth over the situation with a gentle voice. "Everyone, this is the day of our new family's beginning. Let's leave the past in the past and celebrate these young couples' new life together." A sigh of relief escaped from the room at those words. The orchestra began to play a soft waltz. Elizabeth returned to the dance floor, led by Michael. While dancing, Elizabeth surveyed the room. Her parents' seats were empty. They had quietly left the venue without anyone noticing. Only Rachel's handbag remained at her seat. "Any regrets?" Michael whispered. "None. I think this is our true beginning." Elizabeth's voice carried conviction. What she lost by speaking the truth was significant. But what she gained was worth even more. Michael's love, the understanding and support of the guests, and above all, her own pride and the courage to face the truth. Outside the window, Boston's twilight was gently enveloping the city. The sunset reflecting on the Charles River seemed to sparkle with the promise of a new tomorrow. Elizabeth smiled quietly as she nestled against Michael's chest. 6 months after the wedding, the Back Bay streetscape had shed its winter severity and was welcoming spring. "Mrs. Foster, your 6 o'clock appointment has arrived," called Linda, her secretary. After marriage, Elizabeth had changed her surname from Gray to Foster, her husband's name. That choice also carried the meaning of breaking with the past. "Thank you, I'll be right there." As she stood up, she glanced outside the window. The new condominium Michael had designed was gleaming in the sunset. Their first major project together had been a remarkable success. When she returned home after work, Michael had prepared a warm dinner. Their new home was on the top floor of a high-rise apartment overlooking the Charles River. The space Michael had designed himself perfectly reflected Elizabeth's tastes. "I heard from David today," Michael quietly began while they were eating. Elizabeth paused with her fork midair. "The divorce is final. He got custody of the children. Rachel only got supervised visitation rights." Elizabeth heaved a deep sigh. Her sister's fall had been greater than expected. The events at the wedding had become rumors in the investment industry and had affected David's company. When Rachel's history of infidelity came to light, her current behavior was also questioned, leading to a thorough investigation. As a result, several of her inappropriate relationships were discovered. "Rachel has started living alone in a New York apartment," Elizabeth said. Her sister's once luxurious lifestyle had completely collapsed. The financial support from their parents had also been cut off at David's demand. "How are the children?" "Yes, David's parents are taking care of them. They took them to the Boston Aquarium last weekend. They drank their wine in silence. There was sadness, but it already felt like a distant memory." Their relationship with their parents had also changed dramatically. After the wedding, their father John was hospitalized with a sudden illness. That became the catalyst for them to seriously face their past for the first time. "Dad has started going to counseling," read the email that arrived from her mother Martha last week. However, the text still showed concern for Rachel, and Elizabeth had put off replying. Her parents' change was still only halfway there. "Are we inviting your parents to Christmas dinner next month?" Michael asked. Elizabeth thought for a moment before answering. "We might need a little more time. I want to be sure they've really changed." Outside the window, the surface of the Charles River sparkled, reflecting the night view. Elizabeth sat on the sofa and snuggled close to Michael. "How's work?" "Yes, it's going well. Actually, I have some happy news. Elizabeth smiled somewhat shyly. I'm being promoted to partner at the firm next year. Michael embraced his wife. Elizabeth's capabilities were highly regarded in the industry. The events at the wedding had actually proved her integrity. And one more thing. Elizabeth guided Michael's hand to her abdomen. What, really? Yes, I confirmed it this morning. 3 months along. They embraced and celebrated like high school students. The birth of a new life. It meant the beginning of a new page in their lives. That night, Elizabeth opened her diary for the first time in a while. Since her wedding day, she had recorded her thoughts every week. Tonight would be a special page. To my beloved child. We have begun preparing to welcome you. This family's history has both light and shadow. But perhaps that's what life is. What's important is having the courage to always face the truth. And knowing what real love is. The world you will be born into will surely be wonderful. Dad and I will do our very best to make it so. Putting down her pen, Elizabeth gazed out the window. Boston's night view sparkled like countless stars. A new season was surely approaching. What she lost by speaking the truth was significant. But what she gained was worth even more. True love, unwavering trust, and above all, a life she could be proud of. Michael embraced her from behind. Their shadows reflected in the window pane. It was a quiet and certain scene, promising a happy future.